I went to an amazing school in Golders Green, which was run by two women who were Victorians, very Victorian in their behaviour. And so it had this strange staff of Miss Joan Courtney Luck, Miss Carmichael and Miss Fothergill.
The art room was run by a lady in a flowery smock, and she had the hairstyle we used to call earphones. And she was a confused, frightened creature, and she used the belt quite liberally too, if you weren't behaving or concentrating.
I had a friend who I used to walk home with her from school, and we were both saying, when we were 16, what we were going to do. And that day, he said, I'm going to be an architect, and he did become an architect, and I said, I'm going to be an artist, and I did become an artist. And that was all in 10 minutes walking home.
I do remember I was probably about 9, and I did write an essay which one of our teachers gave me very good marks for. And I did decide then, I didn't think of being a painter, that I would be a writer.
I insisted that I wanted to be a painter, and my mother said, why don't you buy paintings if you're so keen on them? And I said that it wasn't the same thing, but she didn't want me to go to the Slade, which was the place I went to.
When I was 15, Aunt Rose stayed with us, and she had a friend, Dr. Minnie Atkins, and Minnie had gone to university and she was clever, and she saw my sketches, and it was she who suggested I went to an art school. She thought I had talent. Although I hadn't heard of such things as art schools, I thought, what a wonderful idea. It had an extraordinary effect on me, that remark. I suddenly felt enormously excited, and immediately I wanted to do it. When I was 15, I went to St Martin's, although we didn't know it, it was one of the best art schools. But it was like sticking a pin in, really.
I had suggested that I'd like to go to an art school. They said that was out of the question. When I was now 18, and I'd met this young sculptor, and I was very impressed that this young sculptor could have a studio to work in and make things all by himself there.
Quite different from having to take a job.
It sounded a wonderful life. So my mother said, well, she knew a sculptor called Thomas Clapperton, and I better go and see him. And he advised me not to try to be a sculptor because it was a hazardous life. Curious man, because he was the sculptor who did the frieze on Liberty's building. And anyway, he said, no, that was not a very good profession to try.
Being young and arrogant, I mean, I often went the opposite way from what other people would have considered a good career move. I mean, as a child in Scotland, it was littered with lots and lots of what was called flea pits. There were small cinemas, all geared to the poorest people. You could get in for a penny. And they had all the most outrageously wonderful American films. And occasionally a boring English one, occasionally. And always taken by my mother on her day off to go and see a film. So I saw a lot of films in my childhood.
But we were all cinema mad, and I used to go at the age of 7 and 8 on my own. I couldn't go in because you weren't allowed to, and I would ask the adults in the queue to take me in, which they did. I mean, I would give them my money, and they would get my ticket.
I grew up with that whole image, the beginning of a film, where the world turns round and there's flashing of radio, and it was all glamorous, even before the film started. And one was very much educated by the cinema about the American idea of life. When I was a child, there was always a kind of atmosphere about American films.
Mickey Rooney and Shirley Temple.
The Andy Hardy films seemed to offer a totally different world. There was always a kind of shock when you came out after an Andy Hardy film that you were going backwards into the real world, backwards. There were people who were incredibly conscientious at the Slade, whereas there was a wonderful cinema near the Slade called the Tolmer. Sometimes I'd go there in the afternoon, and that was considered appalling. I was longing to get back to the world that had deeply moved me when I was younger, like bad films. And that's very beautiful, the way that certain art has its date look. Certainly movies. I think movies are the most powerful human expression we have. There was these fog-bound days. A very grey, austere London, particularly the winter of 46. The Secret Agent by Conrad's, that was the London that one, it was foggy, and it had moving through the fog all these lost souls somehow. Everything was rationed right up to the 50s. And of course people had a matching life. There was no interplay or exuberance about people's relationship with each other. It was bitter and frightened. And if you read something about Soho at that time, there was these strange girls, parties were bizarre. It was a world of lost souls and mental cripples.
I think that's going a bit far.
In the mid-50s, I got a studio next to Kenneth Armitage. That was an old stable or something. So I was quite friendly with Kenneth.
I found a place to work in London, in Notting Hill Gate, at some old stables, which then for 4 years was really the most active creative time of my life. I had endless girlfriends and everything else. It was sort of burn-up. And, well, it was a slum. Dirty old mattresses left outside, but I loved it.
Chadwick and Armitage were considered hot shots, and they used to have kind of wild-pack life of boozing and womanizing and all that.
In 61, I think, in the Evening Standard one day, I saw a studio for sale, and immediately I saw it. I had to have it, because it was a marvellous space. I think John Singer Sargent had mine at one time, and they've been occupied by painters since they were built. The studio opposite mine was occupied by Rodrigo. I always asked Rodrigo to come and see the Academy pictures before I sent them. And he would come in like the Pope, and then I would place a chair there for him to sit in. And then, fortunately, mostly, he said, "Oh, yes, that's right." You could live and work there. It's my only home, in fact. And when I moved in, my rent was £3 a week.
A lot of people had £2 a week given to them by an aunt, and they all used to come and eat in Bertorelli's in Charlotte Street. And you could just exist in London on £2 a week and have a studio and just get one meal a day in Bertorelli's. It was possible to be an artist without any money in those days.
I've always been good with a broken pencil. I find it difficult ever to draw in an expensive drawing book. Scraps of paper.
While at the Slade, I was living on £1.50p a week. Now, this seems unbelievable, but in fact, if you were immensely careful, you could just live. I lived on porridge with dates in it, and I had one meal a week in a restaurant, but not Bertorelli's, but Paggioli's. You could get a meal for 9p, the tiny little spaghetti meal you could have. So you could live very cheaply indeed.
We would go down the road, Euston Road, and went to what was called Giant British Restaurant. They seemed to specialise in 3 types of boiled potato, with just a smattering of mince. But we were contented.
There were a group of people in a group of places. I went to the Mandrake more than the Gargoyle. I was very attractive in those days, and there was always sort of response to where I went. So one was part of really like a club almost. Roger Hilton would come down frequently to that studio, and then he saw what I was doing, and we would also go to exhibitions together. And then he liked the chocolate cake in Lyon's Corner House, so we would finish up having tea there. It was friendship and work, and I was one of the few people he didn't insult ever. He was incredibly rude to people, but it was a form of truth, really. Everything he said was true. But fortunately, he was never like that with me. He was incredibly funny and witty and outrageous.
This studio, this what I would call an intelligent shambles. But what's torture for me is the opposite. If I have to spend 3 days in a strange town, in a strange hotel, I feel naked. This studio, in a sense, everything that's in here, there's tons. But I have my 6-foot shelves of books which I have to see the titles every day. Actually, when I walk to the kitchen, I like to just glance at the titles. Unlike going to a library, these books are always there. I just feel walking in here is like walking into a mind. It's an external view of a thinking process.
Eileen Agar always was a surrealist, and wherever she lived, her surroundings always looked exactly like one of her paintings. She had wonderful juxtaposition of objects around her house, and her pictures merged with her objects, and even her dining table looked like a surrealist painting, which reminds me I must ring her up.
My studio was really one immense collage of all sorts of things. I had little cutouts that I did and pasted on the walls.
So I met some Americans who were quite influential, and they gave me piles of magazines which I used for collage in a timid kind of way, because when I did these early collage, nobody quite thought they were art at that time. With these Americans, after dinner we would cut up magazines and play around as a sort of after-dinner activity. You could buy these magazines down the Charing Cross Road, quite cheap. But I mean, I was just trying to express an idea of the bizarre way that through advertising the Americans saw the world. I mean, there might be like Cover of Life magazine, showing how absolutely different it was from picture posts. Collage has also been a kind of tool where you can sprinkle the elements. The nature of collage is often going beyond preconception. By chance, you can make another reality.